ラスト。やったぞ。発動したぞ。
Initially released on September 22nd, with a subsequent Steam release on October 6th of 2017, Doki Doki Literature Club is a dating visual novel developed by Salvato Games, which is really just one guy named Dan Salvato. The game follows the exploits of a self-insert protagonist trying to bed one of the 3 girls that you attend the titular literature club with. And as anyone who is aware of the game already knows, Doki Doki Literature Club is actually a horror game in disguise. An extremely poor disguise, mind you, but we'll get to that. The game is currently being praised by what seems like anyone and everyone for being a modern-day horror masterpiece, how it scared people shitless, how it's the most messed up horror game released this year, how it's uncomfortably horrific, so on and so forth. Now, I'm a bona fide horror junkie, so when I heard about it, the game sounded like it would be right up my alley. Not to mention, for the price of absolutely free, it was a bargain I couldn't miss out on. So, I downloaded it, played through it all, and I have to say, despite my best efforts to enjoy the game, I just don't understand the praise and hype. Doki Doki Literature Club is not outright awful, not by any means. There's a lot to enjoy here that even I got a kick out of, but calling it an excellent psychological horror experience seems like people heavily overinflating its quality. Now, this won't be a review of the game in the traditional sense of the phrase, more of an explanation of my own stance on the game, and more specifically, why I think it falls flat as a horror title. And again, if you enjoy Doki Doki Literature Club, that's fine. If you were emotionally impacted by the characters, found the horror to be effective in any way, or liked it for another reason, I'm not going to fault you for that. This is just why I, despite my best efforts, couldn't seem to get into the game whatsoever. As absurd as the statement may sound, many of my issues with Doki Doki Literature Club can be summed up in the first thing the player encounters in the game. I'm talking, of course, about the trigger warning. Now, the conversation on the validity and implementation of trigger warnings across the board is something we'll not touch on here or in any of the videos on my channel. Politics are not video games after all. But I just don't think that a trigger warning works in the context of Doki Doki. After all, in this horror visual novel trying to hide the fact that it is indeed a horror visual novel, this is the first thing the player will read. This game is not suitable for children or for those who are easily disturbed. Individuals suffering from anxiety or depression may not have a safe experience playing this game. Now, to be fair to Dan Salvato, he probably put this in the game with the best, most benevolent intentions in mind. But for a game trying to mask its true genre, it ruins that reveal through its very inclusion. It doesn't stop there though, as it also gives you a link to the official website set up by Salvato Games, which tells us without telling us that the game will feature suicide, self-harm, i.e. cutting because it's always cutting when people say self-harm, child abuse, and delve into depression in some way. This single warning that you can't skip, and to a lesser degree the optional one from the site, pretty much ruins the experience that Doki Doki Literature Club had clearly intended. Now, from the moment I started the game, got to the title screen, and saw the cute anime girls while an upbeat soundtrack played in the back, I knew what was going to happen. One of the girls would kill herself, one would be a cutter, and one would have some abusive guardian. Surprise, surprise, that's exactly what happened. Although in the game's defense, there was more to it than just that. Giving us this warning immediately off the bat pretty much spoils the first major reveal, which is the game's most talked about shocking moment, and renders the attempts to disguise itself as a standard dating visual novel completely moot. In fact, I'd call the hidden horror aspect of this game a complete bust, and those who didn't see it coming were not reading the clear writing on the wall. After all, the game's top user tag on Steam page is psychological horror. There's an aforementioned trigger warning which you see from moment 1, and the interactive poetry writing minigames have very dark and depressing word choices even from the very first one you complete. Hell, we also can't ignore the fact that nearly everyone who's praising this game and spreading it by word of mouth are doing so by saying that it's a great horror game. If someone managed to somehow avoid the user tags and media coverage, as well as ignore the trigger warning and not think about the poem word choices, then I'd concede that it might work as a stealth horror game, but the chances of that happening for the majority of those who have played and praised the game are slim to none. To be frank, the wolf in sheep's clothing aspect to Doki Doki Literature Club is an abject failure. It's also worth noting that this game going from cutesy visual novel to spoopy scary visual novel is nothing that an avid consumer of these types of anime games should be blindsided by, for all of the reasons mentioned prior and the prevalence of this idea in anime. Now, as a casual consumer in the medium, I can't give you a very insightful take on this, but this idea of stories centered around fucked up things happening to cute girls isn't a new one. Some decently popular examples being Madoka Magica, School Live, Higurashi no Nakakoro ni, and the recent Made in Abyss, just to name a few. Hell, if we're just talking about genre inversions going from standard upbeat fare to disturbing deconstruction, one of the most famous anime franchises out there essentially popularized this. What I'm saying is the concept of cute anime settings turning into horrific ones is nothing new or novel, and when paired with the clear outline signs earlier, the target audience of Doki Doki Literature Club would have, or at least should have, seen the horror coming. Doki Doki Literature Club seems to have an issue respecting the player's ability to grasp at its ideas and themes in general, but I'll expand upon this later on in the video. The trigger warning being placed at the very beginning segues into another issue with Doki Doki, one that actually does negatively impact the experience across the board: the atrocious pacing of the game. Despite all of the clear signs of what direction the game will head in, Doki Doki Literature Club still tries to keep up the veneer of being a regular dating visual novel for far too long. The initial premise of the game is that you control a self-insert player character who, on the whim of their bubbly and sort of airheaded childhood friend Sayuri, join the literature club at their high school. Alongside Sayuri, the club consists of Yuri, the quiet introverted bookworm, Natsuki, the manga-loving tsundere, and Monika, the Stacy president of the club. The player spends their time interacting with the girls, deciding which of the three besides Monika they want to get in the pants of. Now, I only recorded one playthrough for this review, and I chose to try to get into Yuri's pants for this one, for two very obvious reasons. Whomever you choose, the rough playthrough will be the same. Play a minigame where you write a poem, picking 20 words out of a possible 200 that best appeal to the girl you've decided to orbit, and then go and interact with the club members, read all the poems that they write, and try to make your chosen girl sopping wet with your own purple prose. You repeat this process a few times, and altogether the time it takes for the player to go from the dating game to the inevitable shoe finally dropping is about an hour, maybe even more if you take your time trying to read everything. Considering how heavily implied the disturbing horror aspects are from the get-go, this is far too long to wait for the ball to start rolling. And you know what does get the ball rolling? Nearly an hour and a half into the game, Sayuri kills herself. What a shocker. Yeah, let's get this out of the way. Sayuri's suicide is the big one, so to speak. This single moment has sparked the most discussion about the game, is probably why the trigger warning was implemented in the first place, and marks the true turning point from the overly long build-up to the actual game experience. Here's why I don't like it. For one thing, this is far too obvious. It was apparent from the beginning of the game that a character killing themselves will be an element of the story, and the foreshadowing lacks any nuance. Reading between the lines of Sayuri's poems makes it far too clear that she was depressed, since all the poems written by all the girls clearly indicate their own individual personality flaws, in a manner that's about as subtle as a hammer to the face. Even then, these would have been interesting to think about had the game not flat out told you this was happening. Monika spells it out for the player, and on my playthrough, Yuri outright said that poems were expressions of the writer's own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. Way to spell it out for your audience. We wouldn't want people to read between the lines on their own in this game all about reading. So when Sayuri's mask starts to crumble and she begins to show herself being upset over the main character's decisions up to that point, it felt like the obvious build-up was finally starting to pay off. In fact, I assumed the first time she was absent from the club and the player had to go to her house to check on her, she would be dead right then and there, but we instead get an extended breakdown where she lays the cards out on the table. She tells you how she's depressed, how she tries to mask it by making others happy, how the universe wants to torture her, so on and so forth. Now, this could be a realistic depiction of a teenage girl with depression. I've never been one, so I can't say. But I found this last piece of build-up to the inevitable suicide to be both melodramatic, and once again an instance of the game talking down to the player. I won't touch on the former since I don't want to come across as insulting towards anyone who was really impacted by that sequence, but the latter is an issue with the content of the game as a piece of fiction, so we'll expand on that. During her breakdown, Sayuri spells out how her own behavioral habits, such as being late for school frequently, forgetting to eat breakfast or bring money for lunch, and not cleaning her damn room and sorting herself out, bucko, are all due to her having depression. We get all of these straight from the horse's mouth, which I suppose is fine, but would it not have been more interesting to have these facts be something not brought to our attention? A collection of small details that we can look back on in retrospect as warning signs that, in our own ignorance, we overlooked? It would be pretty effective this way. More effective than having a character sit us down and spell it all out for us at the very least. And finally, getting away from the build-up, let's talk about the suicide itself. I'll be honest with you, for all of the self-indulgent build-up this game has, for the hour plus it takes to get to the core of the experience, and for both of the warnings provided, the fact that the big shocking moment and second act swerve is that a girl hanged herself is just so goddamn tame. Just for comparison's sake, The Cat Lady is a game centered around themes of depression, suicide, and assorted mental illness related topics, and that game has the protagonist try to kill herself within the first 2 minutes. The point is, suicide is prevalent in many horror games trying to incorporate mental illness as a theme, so Doki Doki Literature Club trying to use it as this big shocking reveal is silly when you consider that you have to sit through over an hour of intentionally generic dating game fare and ham-fisted foreshadowing just to get to it. Not going to lie, when I saw Sayuri's hanging body, I felt nothing but relief. We were finally getting to the point. A defense I've heard in favor of this kind of delayed pacing is how it builds tension from the very beginning. Sure, it may seem like uninspired romance fare for a long stretch of the game, and you may know that it's clearly going to turn into something more disturbing, but the delay of the inevitable makes it a suspenseful wait. On paper, this is sound logic, and many would agree with it. There's even a famous Hitchcock example about a bomb that gives this idea context. The thought goes that in a scene where two people are having an innocent conversation while sitting at a table, and the table suddenly explodes, you would have shock. On the other hand, if you establish that there's an active bomb underneath the table before the conversation begins, suddenly that same scene has suspense. However, I don't think Hitchcock would agree that leaving the audience hanging for over an hour of the narrative's runtime would be a good idea. Even at the half-hour mark of something like Psycho, we already have intrigue over Marion embezzling money, going on the run, getting caught in poor weather and taking up lodging at the Bates Motel, Norman Bates already acting like a weirdo from the very first time the audience sees the character. We learn of his unhealthy relationship with his mother, and we get a mystery of why she's never on screen. Even before the iconic shower stabbing scene, which happens about 40 to 45 minutes into the film, you have intrigue and suspense with enough unanswered questions to keep the audience invested. Hell, just looking at the vast majority of acclaimed horror films labeled as suspenseful or psychological horror, things still happen fairly early on. You need some sort of inciting incident to keep your audience invested, and Doki Doki Literature Club has practically nothing going for it until you find Sayori's hanged corpse. The reluctance of Doki Doki to just get on with it is unacceptable for something whose real intention lies within its horror content. Although this would assume that the horror content we be getting to at a faster pace would have been all that good on its own. Put simply, Doki Doki Literature Club as a horror game is kind of flaccid. The majority of the scares present in the game are jump scares, visual and audio distortions, fourth wall breaks, which we'll touch on later in better detail, and, for lack of a better expression, creepypasta tropes. To be frank, a lot of the content in Doki Doki Literature Club comes across like something you would read in a haunted video game pasta. Hyper-realistic eyes and mouths, bleeding eyes, a previously innocent game becoming disturbing, the game breaking the fourth wall, talking directly to the player, and messing with the game files. Once again, we'll touch more on the meta aspects later on. This makes some sort of sense when you consider that Dan Salvato wrote one around the time he started production on the game, implying that he had some prior experience with creepypasta. It's not as if the use of these tropes is necessarily a bad thing. In another context, they can be kind of fun, actually. Jump scares are something of a point of contention among horror fans, with many loathing them outright across the board. But I can get behind a well-done jump scare. As others have no doubt said before me, it's kind of the same appeal as those silly haunted houses at amusement parks, and in a more over-the-top horror game like Resident Evil or Dead Space, jump scares can make the experience more fun when they're done well. In context to Doki Doki, I'll have to be honest. Anime girl jump scares and hyper-realistic eyes aren't things that frighten me. They're limp and kind of off-putting if I'm being honest. However, the user tags on Steam label it not as a standard horror game, but a psychological one. Even looking at it in this context, Doki Doki Literature Club does not work as a psychological horror game. Now, psychological horror is described as being a subgenre of horror and psychological fiction that relies on mental, emotional, and psychological states to frighten, disturb, or unsettle readers, in our context, players. On the surface level, Doki Doki seems to fit this description, at least for some of the runtime, but due to how the characters lack any real dimension beyond their outlined tropes, I'd say it doesn't effectively work. Up to this point, you may have noticed how I haven't touched on the cast of Doki Doki beyond the broad strokes, and the reasons for this tie into why this game doesn't work as a psychological horror story. For these kind of narratives to work, you need a strong, dynamic character or cast of characters with interesting personalities to explore through the horrific situation the story centers itself around. Unfortunately, the three girls that you can try to hold hands with in Doki Doki Literature Club do not matter as individual characters in the slightest. As we're informed in the game's conclusion, any real quirk or trait that these girls had was either written into the script by the developer himself, or intentionally fucked with by the fourth wall shattering Monica, and that none of them had their own agency to begin with. After all, the game deliberately calls attention to the fact that the three primary characters are just files in a program, which negates the idea that they possess individual personalities worthy of analysis. For lack of a more elegant expression, Sayuri, Natsuki, and Yuri are just a group of puppets to be used by Monica and in turn the developer, which is probably why they're just walking cliches. In the first playthrough of the game, you have the shy one, the tsundere, and the bubbly one who's secretly super duper depressed. Even after the suicide happens and the second act begins in the next loop, the characters still fall into clearly identified roles, and don't evolve beyond them. One's a yandere, one's just Asuka from Evangelion, and one's hanging out with Chris Benoit. And again, in the context of the actual narrative, any action these characters take is already predetermined by the scripting, meaning that nothing they do is actually reflective of their own personal agency or a result of their own individual character growth. Simply put, because they don't have any. This is the problem with making the fact that your audience is a gamer playing a video game a part of said game's narrative, as it invalidates a lot of what the writer is trying to do with the characters. After all, everything that these three do is simply preordained fiction, and the game deliberately calls attention to this. Everything we just went over, when paired with the creepypasta scares that dominate the horror content of Doki Doki, really diminish the possible power that this game could have had as a piece of horror, psychological or otherwise. However, for all the criticism I've thrown at Doki Doki up to this point, specifically at the horror aspects and characters, there are two notable exceptions to these. Two exceptions which I've briefly name-dropped but haven't explored up until now. It's what makes me have some degree of appreciation for the game, regardless of all the flaws I've outlined so far. I'm speaking, of course, of the fourth wall breaking aspects and the character of Monica. With the only name that doesn't fit into the Japanese naming convention that the other three adhere to, and being the only member of the literature club that the player character cannot attempt a romance, Monica certainly does stand out from even the earliest moments of the game. She's the president of the literature club itself, and also self-aware of her existence as a video game character inside of a romance-themed visual novel. It's through her machinations that we get the fourth wall scares in Doki Doki, and the reveal that she was responsible for the mind break of two of the girls. Now, the fourth wall aspect of the story is sort of a double-edged sword, since on one hand it only solidifies the issue of Sayuri, Natsuki, and Yuri being designed intentionally to be shallow caricatures of things people consider to be anime tropes. It further begs the question as to why the game would put the player through so much needlessly long build-up with these three characters in an attempt to get us invested in them, only for the grand reveal to be they never really mattered to begin with. While it does highlight existing issues with Doki Doki, I won't lie that, when looked at on its own, the fourth wall stuff was actually fairly interesting for me. While it's not entirely original, I'm pretty sure I'm Scared has the market cornered on fourth wall breaking free indie horror games, the shtick of a game messing with the file folder while you play it is still kind of novel. It's actually one of the fun tropes taken from video game creepypastas that add some neat interactive elements to the mix, and some of the things that Doki Doki does with the concept are pretty unique. At least, there's something that in my limited exposure to the visual novel genre I haven't seen before. There's quite a number of these in the game, so I won't waste your time any more than I already have by listing them all, but a few highlights are present. One is how the chat log history deletes certain messages that the game or Monica doesn't want the player to read, another being how it detects if you're using a recording software to capture gameplay footage and gives you a jump scare for doing so, and all of the text files added to the main folder intermittently and deleted shortly thereafter. Again, not saying this is genius or unique or anything, and certainly doesn't make this an amazing psychological horror experience, but it's fun. And sometimes fun can be okay. What pushes it from being just a gimmick and into the territory of being conceptually a kind of interesting horror experience is through the character of Monica. I'm not saying she's an amazing antagonist with a deeply layered personality or anything like that, but I found her situation and presentation far more interesting than anything else up to that point. Now, before we explore Monica, let's quickly go over the concept of existential horror. In a grossly abridged summary, existential horror is a subgenre all about using narratives to question elements of our day-to-day existence. What exactly is reality? How valid is the existence of the individual in the grand scheme of the human race or universe at large? Does one truly have free will, or merely just a series of conditioned responses? Things along those lines. And a story with existential horror themes would take questions like these and flip them on their head in unnerving ways. For a couple of quick comparisons, a lot of topics covered in Philip K. Dick's novels fit this description, specifically his masterwork Ubik for some more surreal ideas. Or for a video game example, think of the Arsenal Gear section from Metal Gear Solid 2. With all of this in mind, while Doki Doki Literature Club may be a poor example of psychological horror, it certainly has some interesting ideas that classify as existential horror, and these ideas lie in Monika. In the final stretch of Doki Doki Literature Club, when it's just the player and Monika left, all the cards are laid out on the table. Just as she writes in the About section of the game on the Steam page, which is pretty clever I have to admit, Monika's goal is you. Not you, the named self-insert player character, but the you sitting behind the keyboard. See, Monika is a self-aware character in a visual novel game where she isn't a romance option, and wants a relationship with the you in the real world. She doesn't care who the you clicking the commands actually is, she just wants a relationship with somebody real, rather than the artificial constructs that her friends are. So she messes around with all of the three, causing them to either have a mind break or outright deleting them in Natsuki's case, then deleting practically everything else so she can finally have you all to herself. It's during this final act where the game just has a generally still image of Monika sitting at a table, and a version of the classroom situated in some sort of impossible space. The player seems to only be able to listen to Monika talk to them directly, detailing how she went to the character folder to delete Sayuri, Natsuki, and Yuri's files, not so subtle hint, and can spend potentially upwards of 2 hours talking about minor things to the player. Hell, you can even quit the game at this point, load it back up, and Monika will still be sitting there, because apparently she's self-aware during the entire time the game is off. Here's the question though, is Monika really self-aware? Not during that span of time specifically, but in general. Now, obviously the answer is no, as in our reality she's clearly just a pre-scripted character in a free computer program designed to appear as if she was conscious of her existence as a video game character. That's just the thing though, Doki Doki Literature Club is continually calling attention to the fact that it's a game being played on the player's own personal computer. Is it really such a stretch to look too far into this kind of idea for a game seemingly all about breaking the fourth wall? Monika complains about how her friends have no free will of their own, but if this is only because they're characters in a video game with predetermined scripting, wouldn't that imply that Monika herself has no free will? After all, every single meta moment and line aimed directly at you was a moment or a piece of dialogue written and implemented into the game not by Monika herself, obviously, but Dan Salvato, the developer. All Monika truly has is the illusion of free will and self-actualization, an illusion which only serves to cause the character distress and was only bestowed upon her by Salvato himself. Her scripted adherence to her own self-aware nature is a detail which makes Monika a slave to her own pre-existing design, nothing more than a puppet for the narrative just as the other three characters who, in her own words, have no free will. The game's true ending makes this even more interesting. After deleting Monika's own character file while in the Phantom Zone, she has a change of heart of her actions and restores the game back to its original form as the seemingly happy romance visual novel, albeit without Monika herself being present. Things proceed as usual, until Sayuri begins to show warning signs of becoming self-aware herself, exhibiting behavior exactly like Monika was not too long beforehand. Monika then regains control over the program, despite being deleted, becoming a convenient Deus Ex Machina, and decides that since there's only misery to be had in Doki Doki Literature Club, it all might as well be deleted. Cue end credits. However, as we already went over, Monika wouldn't actually be acting of her own volition like we're led to believe, but simply acting out what Salvato had outlined for her. Her decision to delete it all is simply yet another one of those actions, and the final message at the very end of the game is a nice little capstone to this read on Monika. Rather than the character doing yet another fourth wall break speaking to the player directly, we just get a standard error message saying the following: "Script file is missing or corrupt. Please reinstall the game." This is interesting. I didn't test this out to be certain, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think on a theoretical second playthrough after either uninstalling or reinstalling the program, or just deleting your save content in the game folder already installed, Monika would comment on the player doing so. For one thing, I'm not sure how that'd be possible to do in the first place, but even within that limitation, it does serve an interesting purpose. This is because, despite the illusion of being a self-aware character, Monika is in reality just another preordained actor in the interactive play of Doki Doki Literature Club. Now how's that for some high quality fart sniffing? All jokes aside, this aspect of Monika's character really made me invested in this portion of the game, at least from a conceptual point of view. It's a takeaway that's consistent with the narrative given to the player up to that point, and unlike most of the other horror concepts I've whined about up to this point, Doki Doki Literature Club at no point spells this out for the player. In this regard, it's relatively subtle in comparison to everything else in the game, which is a nice change of direction. And if Dan Salvato's tweets on the matter can be taken seriously, this might be the capstone to the meta-commentary on romance or dating visual novels which Doki Doki is apparently making. Just as Monica will never truly be sentient nor sapient, only acting out a preordained script to appear as if she were, the relationships and romances that you form during a playthrough of a romance visual novel will only ever be illusory. Actually, as others have already pointed out before me, the whole game could be seen as an exploration of the unhealthy ideas of love that are present in a good chunk of romance-themed media. Unfortunately, I'm far too autistic to ever understand something like love or do the concept justice, so I won't touch on it any further. So, for a video supposed to explain why I don't actually like Doki Doki Literature Club, I spent the last chunk of it being pretty absurdly positive. So let's change gears back to what you've come here for, because for all the praise I gave for how Monica was handled, it still has one major issue, which ties into the larger gripes I've had of the experience as a whole. Length of duration. Now, my recorded playthrough of Doki Doki Literature Club took me a touch over 4 hours, and out of that 4-hour chunk of gameplay, I'd say about 25 minutes were dedicated to all of the Monica endgame that I spent all this time talking up. This just further exacerbates two issues, one we've already discussed, and one we've yet to touch upon. The one we've already touched on is how Doki Doki Literature Club is just very, very poorly paced. It takes over an hour to get to the real meat of the experience, which itself only really pays off at the small chunk in the very end of the game when the player gets all the details. This end segment with Monica, as we already went over when talking about her character, also negates the build-up with the other three characters and diminishes the intended shock value of Sayuri's suicide in retrospect by a great margin, assuming it even impacted you at all. We could go on all day, but the game really should have had some real inciting incident during the first 20 minutes to half an hour or so, just to really pull the rug out from under the player while they still might not expect it. This is compounded by another issue that we haven't gone over yet, the game's seeming lack of a focused direction. Simply put, the game tries to be an effective character-driven experience, a campy creepypasta-inspired game, and then explore fourth-wall-shattering existential dread in the finale. Doing two of those would have been a difficult tightrope to walk, but trying to do all three while maintaining any sort of consistency is improbable, to speak lightly. This seems to be a pretty common point raised by those who don't enjoy Doki Doki Literature Club, but the game should have tried to have focused on either the character-driven and mental illness theme side of things, or just go balls out with the crazy Monica stuff. It tries to do both at once, and as a consequence does the former poorly, and doesn't explore the latter to its full potential. Before we finish up with some closing thoughts, let's touch on one aspect of Doki Doki Literature Club that people have been buzzing about for a little while now. Apparently through some ARG magic using files within the game's directory folder, some redditor did a cool thing for once when a user named MitHost wrote a post titled, "Doki Doki Literature Club has more to it than we think." To grossly summarize the guy's post, as usual link in the description, Doki Doki Literature Club may just be an extended teaser for Dan Salvato's real game, called at this stage Project Libitina. I'll also link to the site with the lore details for that game, but it sounds like the story will be centered around some type of government experiment, a sort of MKUltra thing for the most surface level of comparisons. Now, a paranoid conspiracy thriller that toys with the ideas of the fiction's reality and interactive medium sounds like it would be more up Dan Salvato's alley, based on how he handled the meta things in Doki Doki. I'm all for this idea, it sounds like it could be pretty neat. In this context, judging Doki Doki Literature Club on its own as a piece of viral marketing, then I'd call it an absolute success. In fact, this may be the single most impressive piece of modern video game marketing I've seen this side of PT, the playable teaser for the now dead-in-the-water Silent Hill revival. And I'd actually go on record to call Doki Doki a far more impressive advertisement than Kojima's ever was. Think about it. While PT had numerous high-profile names to fall back on, with Hideo Kojima, Guillermo del Toro, and the twin Itos of Masahiro and Junji, not to mention the Silent Hill IP itself, Doki Doki Literature Club had none of that. Instead, it had to build hype, attention, and a name brand for a property which had nothing to give it any sort of credibility, and somehow, without any of these things that PT had, it accomplished this. According to Steam Spy, at the time of this writing, Doki Doki has been downloaded just under 1.5 million times, and the videos on the topic have upwards of double these numbers in views. The game released at the tail end of September, and within a few months it built one hell of an impressive word of mouth without any of the pre-existing benefits that something like PT had. Call it a flavor of the month fad all you want, but if Dan Salvato plays his cards right, strikes while the iron is hot, then whatever Project Libitina ends up becoming might just make one hell of a dent in the market. Once again though, despite all of the praise I just heaped on it, this time for being an excellent piece of marketing, this leads into another one of the reasons I don't like Doki Doki Literature Club as a standalone horror game. Yes, it's great marketing, but that just makes it a lesser individual experience, as it's nothing more than a small taste of what should end up being the true full-fledged experience. As such, Doki Doki as is may as well just be unfinished, meaning that any real analysis into the current product might as well be useless. It's like trying to analyze a film trailer or something. Why bother when you can just wait for the finished product? There's also the somewhat troubling idea that Dan Salvato is selling merchandise for an advertisement. A piece of advertisement that's marketing a game which will no doubt be a commercial release. So now that we're at the very end, how would I sum up Doki Doki Literature Club? Well, it's not outright bad or anything, but for all the reasons I've listed, I find it to be a subpar horror game. The in-game scares are limp, feeling more like satirical jabs at video game creepypasta than moments intended to frighten the player, and the atmosphere so lauded by the fanbase was broken by the game's own insistence on reminding the player that they were just playing a video game. 3 of the 4 characters are walking tropes that you spend far too much time interacting with in an intentionally uninteresting manner, seemingly in spite of them not mattering at all in the end. The suicide is one of the single weakest shocking moments that I've personally ever seen be praised by seemingly everyone, and the fact that the game took so long to get to it despite it being very obvious from the moment you start that it would be an inevitable outcome only made it even weaker. And perhaps the real death nail for something being touted as a scarring psychological horror game is how it doesn't seem to have respect for the player's ability to grasp at its ideas. Even ignoring the trigger warning, nearly every idea, a bit of foreshadowing, and character beat in the game is spelled out for us in plain detail, leaving little room for the player to interpret or reflect on the experience. Anything that could have been an understated detail which one could look back on, recontextualized in an entirely new light by what's learned later on in the game, is explained to the player in very ham-fisted ways. Still, even with all the nasty things I've had to say on the matter, Dan Salvato's talent as a creator still comes through. The fourth wall mechanics are neat, Monica's a rather interesting character used to explore existential horror concepts in a fairly unique way, and as a way to spread word on his full project, it's an amazing success story. And one detail about Doki Doki's development that I've been bringing up constantly but never truly addressed up until now was how Doki Doki Literature Club, beyond things like the artwork and limited voice acting, was the pet project of Dan Salvato himself. He wrote, designed, and scored this entire thing all by himself, and it never ceases to amaze me when someone is capable of doing that, regardless of my own personal feelings towards what was created. This guy's going places, one certainly hopes, and now that he has his feet wet in putting out full original releases, everyone can't wait to see what he does next. On its own, Doki Doki Literature Club is an interesting experiment that just didn't pan out as a successful horror game. In my opinion.